the Africa Rising narrative is problematic in a number of ways. Number one is that it assumes that Africa is homogenous. It's a homogenous mass of countries, as opposed to 54 different nations that are very, very unique and different, and have compelling pluses and minuses and gaps in terms of how they move forward and how they show up as entities within this Africa rising narrative. So socio-politically, economically, culturally, traditionally. So I think, applying ourselves and applying a culturally savvy approach to this Africa Rising narrative is absolutely imperative as we seek to communicate with African audiences. So when we say that Africa is rising, does that mean that because South Africa is rising, Nigeria is rising, Angola is rising, what's happening in Mali, what's happening in Burkina Faso, what's happening in Madagascar? So we must be careful. I think it is an absolute duty as communicators in the Africa space to really be careful not to generalize, but also not to leave any country behind, to go the extra mile to try to understand the context in which our audience lives. As fellow communicators, you would know that it is not the responsibility of the person being communicated to understand the message, but it is indeed the responsibility of the communicator to communicate adequately, in a relevant manner and in a compelling manner, to bring our audiences to some sort of action, to incentivize them to action, or to change their perceptions about whatever it is that we're communicating. For whom is Africa rising? So I think it goes without saying that Africa is not rising for all of her children at the exact same time, unfortunately. So we've seen in Nigeria, for example, with what happened with SARS, we're seeing, terrible things happening in Mozambique. I've spoken about Congo. Mali is going through a little bit of a revolution. Cameroon with the Anglophone and Francophone crisis. We've seen that there's still a large majority of Africans that have not risen. So what happens when we put this Africa Rising narrative at the center? And as communicators, what are we doing to make sure that we're pulling along this large majority of Africans that are yet to rise? And then lastly, who defines whether we're hopeless or rising? I think that there was a missed moment when the Africa Rising narrative started to emerge, where we should have taken a little bit of a step back as a collective and thought more critically about who's speaking our truth and why. What is the agenda behind the Africa Rising narrative? Because surely, we didn't label ourselves as being hopeless in the first place. So what role are we playing now, and what role did we play then in driving the rising narrative? Who's behind the narrative, and what is their agenda? So, thinking a little bit more about how we define the criteria of a rising continent. I'm a big believer that whoever controls the mic controls the message and the outcome. So as communicators, I do think we have a major role to play in looking at this narrative critically and saying, number one, are we rising? But also, are we playing any part at all in defining whether indeed we are rising, or where we are, or how we are spoken of as a continent? Having really looked at this Africa Rising narrative critically from the time it emerged to where we are now, my belief is that if there is going to be a new Africa Rising narrative, it needs to be a narrative that is diverse, that takes into consideration all of what we are and who we are as a people and as a continent, that is homegrown and that is not imposed upon us. It's a narrative that we really need to have active participation in as communicators, as business, and as leaders, and also one that is owned, an owned narrative, which means that we are driving that narrative on a day-to-day basis, and we're defining what it is to be a rising continent.